Welcome back, everyone, from our 15-minute monster break. I hope it gave you an opportunity to get a little refreshed and maybe even have a meal. Uh, Today's Dignilogue is about race and policing. And this topic, especially for those of us in the United States, needs little introduction, especially in view of the many tragic and outrageous instances of police killings of people of color during the past year that have become so prominent in our news cycle and in our existence. We certainly have seen previous instances that have become very public over the last several years, but it seemed like, especially perhaps maybe with the pandemic, the election, and all the other things we've got going on in the US right now, the onslaught of so many tragedies involving excessive police force has become very much a part of this very unique year. And so as we started to put together the workshop, I suggested to Evelyn and Linda that maybe we could devote a session to the very challenging topic of race and policing, knowing that while we cannot cover the entirety of what this topic deserves, that certainly we can help to put a human dignity frame on this topic in ways that invites us to walk away with some really important food for thought and very likely some inspiration towards reform and action. So my role here is to facilitate this conversation, and it was my pleasure to invite three wonderful individuals to be part of this conversation. And so I'm going to introduce each of them, and as I mention your name, if you could just give us a wave on the camera, that would be wonderful. Have Charles Hayes. Charles is dialing in from Alaska. It's hard for me to describe Charles in just a few words because he is a philosopher, he's a political writer, he's a novelist. Much of his work is on topics of lifelong learning and self-education, and they include some of my very favorite books. That actually is how I first got to know Charles as friends on Facebook, and certainly reading a lot of his work. But Charles also happens to be a former Dallas police officer who has taken a deep interest in matters of race and policing. His new book is titled Blue Bias, an ex-cop turned philosopher examines the learning and resolve necessary to end hidden prejudice in policing. And that book is attracting growing attention from both the media and the criminal justice communities. Let's go on to Charles. And Charles, why don't you just, you two, just take it away and share with us some insights from your work and your book.
Okay, well, I agree with Tony that with regard to race relations, the history of policing is horrific. David asked me to comment on about this from a perspective of neuroscience and biology. I've focused on the subjects for about the last 5 years. I made some notes, and I'm going to have to read from them because my short-term memory is a mess. So the first item is, we are accustomed to comparing our gray matter to computers, but it's more useful to imagine that we have a chemical factory in our heads and that we are chemically cocktailed to behave tribalistically. The hormone oxytocin, often called the love hormone because of its role in mother and child bonding, is also socially but mysteriously instrumental in goading us to ostracize outsiders, but we still do not understand how this works or what the tipping point is that causes it. The second item is that history suggests we do not grow up in this country with a clear understanding of how bias works and how our limbic system front loads our life experience to consider risk assessments up front. Recall Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, and this will begin to make sense. From the time we are infants, our amygdala, hippocampus, and cingulate gyrus act in a sentinel capacity in which our brains sort, categorize, and stereotype keep us safe from physical harm and embarrassment. We make assumptions subconsciously all our lives without being aware we are doing so, and neuroimaging confirms it. There's an oft-quoted example of a little white girl in the South who, upon seeing a black infant, says, "Look, Mommy, a baby made." If we grow up in a society with systemic racism, it is almost impossible not to have been negatively influenced, at least as a matter of degree, in the form of an intuitive nudge. Implicit bias judgments come to us in milliseconds from our subconscious before our frontal cortex or executive brain function is even aware of the subject at hand. Simply put, our personal opinions about whether we harbor racial biases are pretty much worthless. And police officers who adamantly avoid bias training while believing they don't need it are the people who need it most. The bottom line is that implicit bias can only be mitigated by people who care deeply about doing so. Third is that police officers who engage in frequent altercations are likely to experience physiological structural changes in their brain, with their amygdala growing larger, causing them to become hypersensitive to insult or having their authority challenged. Some behavioral scientists refer to this as a sense of entitlement, which is, I believe, what we saw on the face of the officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck. If police management is not hypersensitive about scrutinizing the behavior of their officers, some of them will get out of control simply from doing their jobs. Police work demands hypervigilance, and working in highly populated cities, it is emotionally taxing. Seeing one's fellow citizens at their worst day after day for years at a time is both physiologically and psychologically taxing. It is hard, extremely hard, not to become jaded and cynical. The frequent excess of cortisol from emotional stress has long-term physical implications, made worse because after an emotionally taxing incident that causes the flood of cortisol, the surge can be repeated simply from recall. And finally, police work is exciting, and the endorphin rushes one experience at a slot machine frequency can become addictive. And if officers are unaware of how this can affect them, they can begin to subconsciously escalate conflicting situations to get an endorphin rush without realizing that they're doing so. Now add to the physical and psychological changes that come with intensive emotional activity, and it's easy to see police officers can begin to crave the very thing that causes them harm. My take is that until we acknowledge the biological and tribalistic nature of our species and how our minds work in mechanically categorizing and sorting, we're never going to solve the problem of implicit bias. Metaphorically, it is like our limbic system photoshops our life experience, not as we think it should be, but as it appears. And when you give this some thought from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Bias is what brains do, and accounting for our tribalistic nature requires an educational patch that is equal to the task. In Blue Bias, I'm trying to improve policing one officer at a time.
Thank you, Charles. That's boy, there's a lot there too. I couldn't help but think that both Tony and Charles are bringing to us sort of the results of journeys, right? From going to a police detective to writing about the abolition of police, from being a Dallas cop to researching and writing about the neuroscience of policing. I think it speaks so much to, as we've talked about in our political lives here, the presence of, adult growth, right, and the need for it, and the way in which people have evolved in their thinking and their insight. Okay, so first, I just want to thank Tony, Charles, and Eunice. Tony, you've been a longtime member of our community. As I mentioned, Charles and Eunice, you are new to this group, but the three of you have brought in, very, very incredibly important insights to this conversation. And you are all three voices for dignity as I've come to know you. So I'm very grateful. And on behalf of our group, I want to thank all of you. To those of you heading into our breakout sessions, there's a lot to talk about, right? And we hope that the combination of perspectives that you've heard gives you something to really, chew on, right? And for some of you, it may lead to action as well, because I think all three of our speakers are not people who are just sort of stuck in the recesses of traditional academic research, but rather are also folks who bring ideas and action together in very committed ways. So let's see, Linda, do you want to just push the buttons that are necessary to lead folks into the breakthrough session discussions?
That's what I'm going to do. Have a great dialogue, everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you.